Ladies and gents, host reaction. This is the Bible Theory Iceberg Explained by Charles Vendigon. This part 3, I guess. Last one. Yeah, so last year is left, if I remember correctly. So far this has been interesting. Explanation of Bible and its stories, basically. How basically related to angels, how Satan is portrayed, especially, about God and God's power in general. That has surprised me. Not surprised me. That has been interesting, like how even the god's name has like a real effect to it. You can't even say its name, right? And I like Wendy Gun's theory about the boy with a linen cloth or whatever, right? Boy with the cloth theory, that how just Jesus saying Jesus' name, which is basically God's name, that would have created some kind of like a, I don't know, power energy field type of thing that might have resurrected some kid or something, right? So that was really interesting, and the kid was just following, because why, like in Bible, that's a story there, and there is no start to it or end to it. There is no lesson behind it. So it's like, why is that story there, implying that must have happened, right, around that time? And even they, like the John basically was writing. John is the one writing, right? Even he didn't know like why is this the case. He just wrote it like this happened. So I like that theory, basically. And Bible's one thing I realized, that all the stories inside has like this kind of like a open interpretation type of element to it. So you can have your own theories and it will have longevity. It's not like you're not gonna come across like many issues, right? Even the some of the issues, like Wendigo point out, when you think about it, you can come to an explanation about it. So it's not gonna feel like, okay, this doesn't make sense completely. So that makes sense, like how Bible has this kind of like longevity, 2000 plus years and still going. So yeah, that's always one.
On to tier 4. Papias' account of Judas's death is pretty gruesome. So Papias is a sort of scholar who's believed to have been a companion of John. I guess John just got along with everybody, must have been a real cool guy. According to history, what Papias would do is he would talk to people who were closely associated or near.
Or maybe John is just saying, or walking around saying, like, I'm the favorite guy of the Jesus, the favorite apostle. That must have helped, right? He was like, oh yeah, all right, I'm gonna hang out with you.
Near Jesus, as he himself never was, and figure out stories around scripture itself. Now, his source can't. Again, this was in year like 80, but according to what he wrote down, Judas did not simply find a tree and hang himself. What instead happened, and bear with me, was he tried to hang himself, to which the rope broke and he fell and essentially exploded, and it says his bowels covered the field. Now, on top of that, Papias says that Judas embodied every sense of ungodliness. In other words, he was incredibly gross and diseased and didn't take care of himself and all of that. So, as he so eloquently describes it, he could not fit through the doorway which a chariot could fit. Now, and again, this is kind of like getting back to my personal opinions. For a long time, Judas was a member of the 12 disciples, so to some degree, he had to at least look the part of being a follower of Christ. And I don't think a lot of people that weren't kings got by on being that rotund in these days, because you got to remember, the disciples were walking with Jesus like a marathon's worth of distance to get from one town to another. So it's in my opinion that this particular account, as well as his description of Judas, just comes from the fact that people at the time really didn't like Judas because they saw him as the reason that Christ died. So I think a lot of their upsetness came out in calling him stinky. And
Yeah, I was about to say that this whole account feels like, but Judas didn't die on the rope. Rope just broke away and he just exploded because he was just like the worst possible human being altogether and all that thing, right? But I like the first account of Judas' death. Basically, he's just like either him just playing the part, which just feels like this like a divine plan type of thing, which is like, okay, I guess it's something we can understand, but there you go. Judas had to do this type of thing, and in the end, he felt bad. And also, even if not that, it's just like Judas felt bad later on. He just hung himself. Even that makes sense. Now he was just a completely worse human being. Then why is he trying to hang himself, right? So I feel like this is one of those things, like people didn't like him much because of this, and they just like amped up all the problems. Like, oh, Judas was just completely the worst.
ugly and other not nice things. Different angel types. So I've kind of briefly alluded to it earlier with cherubims and seraphims and all that. But to be specific, there are 9 different types of angels. Not only are there 9 different types of angels, but they are in 3 different categories of description. There are the angels who directly correspond with God and are in the upper tiers of heaven, which are the seraphim, the cherubim, and the thrones. Well, I've already mentioned the cherubims and the seraphims. The thrones, also known as ophalims, look like this. As Ezekiel described them, spinning wheels within wheels with eyes, and they spoke with thunder and trumpets, which I'm once again emphasizing, be not afraid, that essentially exists near God.
Oh, I am angel. Nah, man, I'm fine. I think I'm gonna go to shop. Bye. I'm not doing this. Nope. Just walk. Somebody could make some kind of a comedy thing with there. I am the angel, just like some kind of like Titanic light and storm and happening, like the spinning lights and spinning, whatever there was, the eyes and everything. Do not be afraid, son. I'm the angel. Like, nope, somebody's just walking away. I'm not doing that. That's just insane, man. Somebody told me that there's a video about Ventigun describing all this angel, which is gonna be insane, right? Yes, the first time he explained how angels used to be like that, I'm like, I have to watch something video like that. But I'm like, Ventigun himself is just like, I need to make video about this.
In the highest level of heaven. On the second tier, you have the angels that are still in heaven but are concerned with the acts of men, which are the dominions, the virtues, and the powers. And then finally, you have the angels that directly interact with man, which is the principalities or princes, archangels, and guardian angels. Guardian angels is an interesting one because they are mentioned in the Bible, but it's unsure if it means another kind of angel that is acting as a guardian or if that is specifically the form this angel is. So 8, maybe 9 types of angels, basically, which I could go into all the other ones, but there's only so much time in this video, and this video has already been going on pretty long, so we'll head on. May do a deeper dive into angelology one day.
Seraphim. I'm guessing that's the highest tier, right? The way he's describing the eyes and everything, right? Other looks like humanoid, huh? So the most like with the special effect type of angels are seraphims. I'm guessing that those are the highest tier, right? Archangels are not the highest tier. Because that's the one thing that surprised me. Everything like anything talks about biblical thing, they always says like archangel just because the name arch is there. Archangels are like the top tier one. Like nothing's like that basically God's children. Like that they are the one, right? Basically God directly talks to them, just like whole board of directors type of meeting there with the archangel. I always assume that kind of thing with Michael and everything, but apparently that's not the case.
Gotta work myself up for it though. Cain's death is referring to Cain, the brother of Abel, who committed the first murder. Because of his sin of killing his brother and again committing the first murder, it's said in Genesis that Cain is forced to walk the earth. Now it's said that Cain was afraid of walking the earth because some group of people would find him and kill him, so God gave him a mark that would protect him from death. And that's the last that Cain's ever mentioned. There's no story of his death or what happened to him afterwards in the Bible itself. Part of a legend that sort of cropped up through the Middle Ages.
That's very open thing, right? Okay, when the book was written, I'm guessing obviously people didn't know how big the earth is, or even if it has end edge. I'm pretty sure like Greeks knew earth was round, but I don't know, like knowledge comes and go, right? So I don't know, during this time people like definitely knew the world is round or not, the earth is round or not. So I guess the story could come from like this is like an endless earth type of thing. You're just supposed to walk it or something, because what is the punishment otherwise? It's just like endless walking, right? No end to it, which is like infinite in itself is like the biggest prison. I'm guessing that must be the thing, right? Yeah, that's like a unique way of thinking, right? People like if people would come across some kind of like a some kind of punishment element to it, they would basically think like, oh, let's think about which type of way to punish. But no, it's like longevity, infinity. That's your punishment. That's the creative in itself.
Is that of Lamech. Now, Lamech is mentioned in the Bible as the grandson or maybe great-grandson of Cain, and Lamech confesses to having murdered someone, much like his grandfather before him. However, the story that began to pop up around the Middle Ages is that Lamech was out hunting and that the mark of Cain was actually goat horns. This was due to the association that was rising during the Middle Ages of goats being demonic. According to that, Lamech was out
Yeah.
hunting, and then his son saw goat horns, had Lamech shoot at it, and it turned out to be Cain. Also, in another non-part of the Bible, part of scripture, known as the Book of Jubilees, in research for this, I began to figure out there are a bunch of books that did not make tryouts. But in the Book of Jubilees, it says that Cain's house fell on top of him and he was crushed to death. However, like I said, none of these are part of the main Bible, and there is a very common belief that Cain is
I mean, if he has a mark of Cain, he's not supposed to die. How his house falling on himself would make him dead or anything else, right? So yeah, it kind of makes sense.
still alive to this day. The idea being that whenever God said you are forced to walk the earth and this mark will protect you from death, he quite literally meant you will walk the earth and not die. The idea being that Cain is forced to forever roam and somewhere out there now exists as possibly just a homeless vagabond or a man wandering through a town as the son of the first man and the man to commit the first murder. I'm once again stating, if you do not think this is cool, I can't help you. St. Paul and Third Heaven is another one.
Obviously, people are not going to believe this, and most Christian even think that these stories are mostly metaphorical, not going to believe this. But imagine for a second, like imagine right now, this second, there is a guy out there walking who's Cain, who's immortal, who's like a son of the first, like Adam or whatever, right? First human, literally walking the earth, right? It will just roam like 360 degrees earth over and over and again. That's just insane when you think about it, right? I mean, the TV show Lucifer, I'm pretty sure features Cain basically, right? Which is like, okay, that show was like fun at start, like any basically simplistic story-wise detective type of show is like, okay, but by the end of it, like, okay, Lucifer should have much stronger power than this. I don't know where the show is going. So it just felt weird with the writing. But yeah, I remember like, Cain. I'm pretty sure like there was Cain in Supernatural as well, right? Any biblical show probably will feature some form of Cain.
One of those quickly mentioned things that causes so many questions. In the book of Corinthians, whenever Paul is talking about the visions of heaven that he had, he specifically says, I entered the third heaven. Now, remember, the whole thing about Enoch seeing the 10-layered heaven is not part of the Bible, which means this is the only reference in the Bible to there being like a multi-layered heaven. Now, this also doesn't line up with what Enoch said, because according to Paul, this third heaven that he went to was a paradise, and that Jesus was there to be with, which, as I mentioned earlier, Jesus is supposed to be at the right hand of God's throne, which according to Enoch is on level 10. So what's that about? If it's that, I guess you could throw out Enoch, sure, but also why did he say third heaven? Why did he have to do that? Because if he would have just said,
Because people like levels, right? We think like video game mentality is today, but no, that's not true. Even back then, like, okay, levels, first level just for nobody. Level 2 is like, okay, level 3 is where all the stuff is at, right? And the Enoch guy basically went to all the way to level 7. Tier system, I guess in all societies, when you realize that there are like hierarchies, level system would come across, right, in your thinking basically. Anyway, there's like tier system, levels would come across. It's not that far-fetched. Like if you're gonna see heaven as an like an actual thing, like how you are in basically what your empire is, whatever empire is, right? Government empire, whatever it. If you're gonna think heaven is equal to that, you're gonna think of it as a system. You're gonna think of the levels and tier system based on that, because why would you not? But then again, everything I've seen of biblical things and how people think of, they think of is like, transcendence type of thing. Like God related things, like heaven things, is much higher than anything human can even understand. And it's like one thing, like one God, one power. It's like nobody can touch it, nobody can understand it. So when you really think about that, you think like, okay, maybe people will think like heaven is just one. There are no levels. Heaven is just, there's just God there, Jesus, everyone's just there. There are no levels, so I just want to think it's just heaven. You think like that's how it would be, but apparently not.
heaven, everyone would be like, oh, that's sweet, paradise, Jesus was there, that's cool. But because he said third heaven, and that's also the part I was referring to earlier whenever Paul said he quite literally saw unsayable things. Now, the common interpretation is that this implies a sort of division. For example, there is the part of heaven that God and the Godhead are in, there's the part of heaven for the angels, and then there's the part of heaven for the saints. There could be evidence of some division between God, the angels, and man while in heaven, but again, no one's really sure. St. John helping Mary is the part I was talking about earlier whenever I said that the beloved, which we're referring to as John, and Mary were supposed to take care of each other. The thing here is that Jesus had a family, which would also be his mother Mary's family, and Mary was married to Joseph. So, where are they at this time? Why does John need to take care of her? Since Joseph is never mentioned after the early life of Jesus, many point this as the fact that Joseph may be dead. Or at the very least, and I don't want to make too many assumptions, Jesus' family, since Jesus is now being crucified and is essentially a war criminal, may have abandoned them at some point. Regardless of the circumstance, Jesus saw it fit for John to take care of Mary. Dead resurrected along with Christ. Another one of those really quick mentioned things that just...
I mean, the point here is like, look, I think the only Joseph has much of close to no role, if I remember correctly, right? Like Mary is like a Virgin Mary, right? So it's God's son, but it's just God. So it's like God is there, Mary is there, and Jesus is there. That's like parents and son type of thing. While Joseph is just like at the side. So it doesn't surprise me that later on he's just not even mentioned, right? Because it's supposed to be Virgin Mary, right? It's supposed to be God, God's son. It's supposed to be Jesus. Like Joseph is not in this picture in that way. So that kind of makes sense. Like nobody would mention him. Maybe it's like one of those the stories type of thing. Like it's there, but it's not important type of thing. I don't know. Like yeah, obviously Joseph is also there, but obviously talk about Mary that way. I don't know.
Okay, so it says that whenever Jesus was resurrected from the grave, to which he died, was buried for 3 days, and came back. It says when all this happened, and he came back, that the dead in Christ were risen, and that they went and appeared back to the people of their town. This is similar to the theory that I postulated when talking about the naked boy in the Garden of Gethsemane, that the holiness or the power that emanates from Jesus is enough to coincidentally cause life or the spirit to return into these bodies. But what's interesting is supposedly all of these graves were open and people came back to life, and they're never mentioned again. No number of how many, how widespread this was, just that several graves were open and people came back. And it's quite possible because at the time of the writing, which was in the book of Matthew, again, one of the Gospels, that Matthew didn't know, so he couldn't say or make up a number for how many came back. And I guess since nothing's said about him, the common belief is that people just came back to life and then they just lived a normal life until they died again. This is more so of what I was talking about earlier, as I said, of that.
Was it that open Pandora's box? Like, okay, if you died and came back to life, like it's like a redo of things. Are you gonna die another way, like how normal human beings die? If not, like, is there any consequences? Like you're a dead who's now alive. Like once you die, it's like there was no consequences of that, and now you're just living normal life. But you're gonna have life. You're gonna have kids again. Like you're gonna have kids whose father is going to be like somebody who's undead but now is alive. It's like confusing type of element to it. But I get again, this like probably thinking too much about it. Even the Bible doesn't mention them again. So I guess you're not supposed to think that much. This is like one of the miracles. Like don't think about it too much.
That sort of offshoot or residual power of God. Balaam's significance refers to the character in the Old Testament known as Balaam. Balaam was a sort of prophet for hire who served false gods. As a matter of fact, he wasn't even one of the people of God and was instead their enemy. The story of Balaam goes that the king tried to have Balaam come up with a prophecy that would damage the children of God, but Balaam wasn't able to come up with one and was instead just giving them blessings, which made the king upset. The reason for this is that God was essentially speaking through Balaam. The reason Balaam holds significance is because he was not one of the children of God, but he was a prophet. It is said he was a prophet for other gods, which what does that mean? And just like the witch at Endor,
Exactly. Like I don't understand the mention of gods plural because that is one of the biggest thing uh, Christianity has. That is one God. Anybody mentions more than one God, it's just like that's no, right? That's like literally enemy of us, like enemy of Christianity, right? Uh, Pagans basically, right? That is a category of pagans. Like anybody who was like one more than one God is considered pagan. So how is anything Christianity explaining multiple gods?
It implies a supernatural power existing outside of God himself. Many attribute stories like this to demons or the wickedness that's referred to by Jesus in the New Testament as where these people derive their power, whereas beliefs like Gnosticism take this and use it as a background for the belief in a non-monotheistic interpretation of the Bible. Simon Magus was a sorcerer who tried to become one of the apostles. He's briefly mentioned in the book of Acts, which talks about what the apostles did after Jesus' resurrection. As it says, he was a sorcerer who saw that the apostles were performing miracles, so he came to them with money to try to pay them to make him one of the apostles so that he could gain their powers. To which the apostles explained, we don't want your money, and it's not what it's about. We're here for Jesus, not magic tricks. And in the canon of scripture, that's that. Well, remember the Acts of Peter, which I mentioned earlier, which is like the non-accepted story of like what the apostles did afterwards? Well, it's got a lot more to say about him, as it says that later Simon challenged Peter to essentially a magic duel, in which Simon began to fly around and was like, haha.
Okay, this guy just went completely Hogwarts here. All right, Adam had okay. I don't know what to say. Like Christianity is so big, so overall in size, so many people are involved. There are offshoot stories. People are like, okay, you know what? That's not canon. Get out of here. That's like fan fiction. Like, he's just opening like duels and Hogwarts and everything. Like I won't be surprised somebody talks about wands or something. Like there's a magic wand.
Your God can't stop me, and then just Peter like essentially zapped lightning at him from God, and then everyone got mad at Peter, and that's why they crucify. You could see why the Acts of Peter aren't accepted, right?
Yeah.
Quite literally the only mention ever of someone flying. Like, okay.
All right, people. All right, check this out. Check this out. I'm more word from God, and just reads the whole story, and everybody just staring at him like, get out of here. What you talking about?
Again, already hard to verify as actual proof of disciples. Even harder to verify when you start talking about a side character being the only person to ever fly. The Gospel of Nicodemus is again another one of the non-canonical entries in the Bible. However, this one is from the point of view of Nicodemus, who was a man who spoke to Jesus in order to try to figure out what salvation means and what God means. And similar to the Acts of Peter, there are pieces of this that are believed by Christian sects who don't even know that it comes from the Gospel of Nicodemus. For example, there are several denominations who believe that in the 3 days between Christ's death and resurrection, that Christ went to hell. But he didn't go there as a sinner, he instead went in order to raise souls out of hell. In some interpretations, he went down there and brought up everyone who had ever died but was righteous, because Jesus wasn't dead yet, and that's a whole other thing to get into. While some say that he went to hell to save Adam, as Adam, who had committed the first sin, had been cursed down there, but now that there was a payment for Adam's sin, i.e. Jesus, Jesus went directly to hell to pull Adam out. Also earlier, whenever I was talking about Mary and how it's not sure what happened to Joseph or her family, in this Gospel of Nicodemus, it says,
All right, when it comes to hell, right? If I remember correctly, Lucifer doesn't own hell or anything like that. Basically, devil. He just basically is like current ruler there. Is something like that, right? Like story about Lucifer when he fell. It's just like he was sent to hell or something like that. So hell existed before him, right? So is this like one of those things like just like heaven exists, hell has to exist type of thing, and there's like a middle ground which is like humans where we live our world. Because origin of everything, like somebody should talk about like what does Christianity say about that? Like did these things like existed forever? Is that what the thing is? Or did I'm pretty sure like fall of Lucifer didn't create hell, right? Hell was always there. Or maybe because of like Adam, basically Lucifer Adam, the story about Eden, where the first sin started or whatever, that's when hell was created or something.
that Joseph was arrested for being the father of Jesus, who was essentially branded a terrorist. Or, I mean, now we call him terrorists. They called him blasphemer now. The government didn't like him, basically. There's also a really cool addition in the Gospel of Nicodemus.
Terrorist doesn't work back then. You need to have organization the way we have today in order to have the word like terrorist. Back then, like everybody was like, even the empires were terrorists, right? An empire can basically, Mongols can come and just terrorize everything. They are the terrorists themselves, right? For them, they are conquerors. For others, they're terrorists. So that, like, that doesn't mean much, right? Nowadays, with the system we have created, global economics, global security in a way, now terrorist makes sense. Back then, just like, it was like, yeah, everybody was terrorist to other people's eye back then.
It's called the Acts of Pilate, which seems to be the letter that Pilate, the guy who sentenced Jesus to death, the letter that he wrote to the ruler of Rome saying that they probably messed up killing this guy. After everything we've said, like when the guy was arrested, he like brought people back from the dead by saying his name, and then
Okay, who was the, was it Julius Caesar alive around this time? Who was the emperor? Man, I don't know the timeline. Around, BC and AD time, right? It must have been like 30 AD or something when this happens, right? Crucifix and everything. What is the timeline? I don't know who was the back then, right? I'm pretty sure it was like, it was supposed to be. Now, wait a minute. Can't be Julius Caesar, right? Wait a minute, right? It is like 60 BC or something. Was Julius Caesar there with the Egypt? I don't know, man. So who who the hell they send a letter to? Oh wait, but I think we messed up. We should not crucify that. I'm not gonna lie. Probably would be Caesar. So wouldn't it be like so surprising? Like the emperor of the Rome at the time was Julius Caesar, and that's when the crucifixion happened. That's like way too like a big thing altogether, right? Like one of the biggest military mind of all time, Julius Caesar was the emperor who basically ordered crucifixion.
like after he came back from the dead, even more dead people got up. It's like at some point you just got to take the L. And we are down to the final tier with tier
Yeah, it is final
5.
tier.
Jesus
What? I thought it was like a final thought. It's a final tier.
changed his
बॉस
Oh.
मैच शुरू होने वाला है
fiction. This is in reference to something that isn't really thought about. So whenever Jesus died, he was, deteriorated
Changed.
and not doing well. However, he came back in, as it said, perfect body. Not only that, but he was able to perform supernatural tasks, such as appearing and disappearing to people and walking through walls, as he did with the apostles. Not only that, but after he comes back, there's no reference of him eating, drinking, or sleeping. This asks a lot of
Well.
questions about what happens to us after we die, or at least in the
Wait a minute. Was that a body in the first place? If that's the case, if the body is like walking through wall, if body is not eating, is that Jesus in spirit form? Is like actual like physical form? Because at that point, it's like all is up to question. Now you think like there are accounts of people actually touching him, but Jesus can just like, you know what? You're gonna touch me. I'm gonna let you feel that you're touching me. I don't know. It feels like, did Jesus around this time during the resurrection had a physical body? The only way to verify is, like I said, like touching Jesus. And I don't know, if Jesus had this kind of power, he could just make people think that you touched me, even though it's not a physical body. That could happen.
Christian context, as it's believed we're given a new body. Perhaps it means a new perfect body that looks like us but isn't cursed with things like, dying. Christ's family is in reference to the physical family that Christ had while on earth. So we know about his parents, Mary.
Okay, I know people might be thinking, what do you mean by curse? Dying is dying. What does that mean? But people need to understand back then, dying was associated mostly with some kind of like a disease type element. Nowadays, we are so healthy and we have this like modern science. People can just die healthy in one spot. It's just like, okay, died and long living, right? Back then, there must have been like element, like after a certain age, there's a high chance you'll just die by some kind of a disease. So you're just not healthy. Something is happening to you, some kind of a disease, right? It's not going to be like, no, there's going to be heart attacks. There's normally healthy people dying, but most people might die just by some kind of a disease way. So I guess that's what it means. Like it wasn't some kind of a disease-ridden body because that's how people would have died. No, it's like a perfectly healthy body. That makes sense. But when we hear about it right now, like okay, you died. Is the what you're talking about, right? Like you don't necessarily have to have like a diseased body in order to die. It could be something like a heart attack or something like that. But no, back then diseases must have been like a biggest thing that why people dies.
And Joseph, but he also had 3 brothers and several sisters. What's interesting and may not be expected is that it's mentioned several times that his family didn't really understand him. While Mary knew he was special as he was conceived miraculously, it says she loved her children the same. Despite this, there are several times when Jesus was young, and remember Jesus, according to biblical canon, was a perfect person. in which his family kept trying to make him stop doing whatever he was doing. They would be confused why so many crowds would gather around, and during one of Jesus's first speakings,
That's
they
similar
were
to
trying
Krishna,
to
I
find
think.
him, saying that he's going to get himself in trouble. It's so interesting to think that, assuming you believe like in this or believe in the potential of it, that the family of the savior of humanity still didn't really get what he was doing. Biblical stories and other religions
That is so similar to Krishna's story, right? I mean, it's surprising that it's not even the same timeline. Krishna's story goes back multiple thousand years, but even in different parts of the world, and they just basically think of the same way when think of divine being that are human. That's why I compare, Jesus to Krishna in that way, avatar way, because Krishna was just like that. Like you think like Krishna is literally God. Krishna is Vishnu, right? There is like no two way about it. It's not like a children of Vishnu. It's not something. It's literally Vishnu in human form. So you think like obviously as soon as like even the day old baby, that's a Vishnu, right? That should know everything. But acted like baby, was baby all around, like all the shenanigans, everything that baby as basically kids do. There are way too many stories about Krishna doing all that, right? So I feel like Jesus, based on this, Jesus was kind of like the same way, right? Families just constantly worrying about it, right? I'm pretty sure there was a story about Krishna just eating the world type of thing. I don't remember exactly, right? I'm forgetting stories as I grow up because it's been a so long time when I heard it all when I was a kid. But there's way too many stories like that, right? Not seeing the world through Krishna's mouth or something like that. There's a story like that. But there's way too many elements to it, right? So the shenanigans and everything. I like Jesus and Krishna has that similarity.
refers to the concept of a origin point with a lot of these stories. Like for example, the flood, which I talked about earlier. Nearly every mythology or religion or belief system has a form of the flood in it. This points back to perhaps there was a flood or a flood similar event, or at
fear
the
of sea.
very least a story of it that was adapted to every other culture. The same can be said about the Tower of Babel, about the plagues, about the dispersion of men, about
the fear of sea,
angels,
man.
demons, gods, all these concepts that are seen across all these different cultures, even Leviathan that I talked about earlier, seem to have some sense of commonality, which makes you wonder, one God Lord, but many.
Ah, man, with the modern technology, we know what sea is, we know what is like a sea floor is, we know how deep it is and all that, but ignore all of that, right? Back then, nobody knew anything. They just knew like this is land and most of it's water. If most of it is water, there are such things as tsunamis and things. You're gonna fear water, right? If you don't know if it's endless or not, how deep it goes, and it's just like sea water all around, you don't even know if the earth is round. I don't know what knowledge they had at the time. At that time, you're gonna fear the water. Water is your one threat, isn't it?
Lesser gods. So this is the thing that I've kind of been alluding to. So with examples like thou shalt have no other gods before me, or the idea of Balaam serving pagan gods, then what exactly could these lesser gods be? There are several different theories around this, some of them quite literally saying maybe yes, there are lesser gods to some degree, whereas others say perhaps these other gods that are being served are the devil and his minions. Whereas I'm going to interject my own theory because I think it's the coolest, and that's the concept of the God of the Gaps. So the God of the Gaps is sort of a theory in this philosophical practice that there are these gods that exist in the gaps of human understanding. For example, 200
What?
years ago,
No.
we had no idea what lightning was.
God of the gaps just a way to describe how people see gaps and assume there must be God. It's not really a theory, right? But basically, if you're gonna believe in God, it's like a fun way. I mean, unknown is where you have no knowledge of something. So if you must think like some mystical, some like a higher being is there, and you don't understand something, you're gonna associate with that, right? So that makes sense.
If someone told you that it was God pointing his finger from heaven to shoot at people with electricity, that would make about as much sense as anything. So because we didn't yet understand how lightning works, to us that might as well been a god. Or in other words, since it was a gap in our understanding, we attributed it as a supernatural thing. Okay, 500 years ago, that was the same situation with the sun and the moon and the stars. So these
that is what it's
lesser
saying.
gods or things of worship could just be those God of the Gaps. There were people who worshiped the sun, there were people at the time who worshiped lightning, there were people who worshiped rain, and all these other phenomena that, going off the canon of scripture, would just be natural occurrences created by God. So to worship them would be to worship a lesser God. That was my philosophy of the day, and that was the best I can do. I hope it wasn't awful. Jesus defeated other gods during the
Yeah, I mean, I, I don't think it's like a version of him or anything. That is what the case was. That is the thing, right? Most religions have like a god associated to something, whether it's sun, moon, lightning, day, night, things like that. Like we didn't even understand like why is there a day or why is there a night, right? We didn't understand like Earth is spinning, so like this when the sun is there, it's gonna give you light. We didn't understand none of that. We just thought there's a sun, there's a light, and that's about it. Why does this all about? Why is everything moving? Why is the stars moving? We didn't know nothing. So obviously we're gonna attribute that to God. That is what God of the gaps is, right? That is what he's saying. So we associated everything with God, and it makes sense, right? I mean, there's people think like, why does Hinduism has so many gods? Because of things like that. When you're like thousands and thousands of years to think about things, you're gonna come up with different, like way too many things and associate God with it. And if you associate God with it, there's gonna be way too many gods because there's way too many things, right? So that does make sense. The Christianity doesn't do that, obviously, like just one God. But I think, if I remember clearly, Christianity basically, in certain times, incorporated all these pagan gods as like lesser gods, like he said, like this. There's only one God, and these are lesser gods. In a way, that's not wrong, because all mythology has one true God or God-like being that is like the one thing. Everything comes after it. Like in Hinduism, or there's Brahmin. I think in Greek, there's like Uranus, right? Uranus and Gaia, I think, right? Uranus and Gaia, it's like two, but basically same thing. That's where it all comes from. And then Titan comes, then like Olympian comes. So every mythology, I think, has one true entity. That's like the main thing.
Ascension. So after Jesus ascended into heaven, or more specifically, as he was ascending into heaven, this is a theory that he literally had to fight his way there. This is going back to the idea of there being lesser gods, which I should mention, I didn't want to take away from everything I just said. All of that was my theory. There are several people who believe that there are lesser gods, and I'm not saying my belief system is any more legitimate than theirs. But this concept is that as he
Yeah, your belief system is not any more legitimate than other, because everybody's belief system is just wrong. All right, because it's belief, right? I mean, I don't think lesser gods thing is just like in Christianity. I think they're just like incorporated pagan things, because if you encounter pagans a lot, you need to incorporate them inside your own thing. Otherwise, they're never going to leave that. And that was Christianity's thing, right? Removing paganism completely. So that's why I think they, by the time they incorporated lesser gods in them, like all this, like Odin and everything, there must have been lesser gods of Christianity, basically under God. So that kind of thing.
was ascending, and there was that still window of time that he was on earth that the evil demons fought him, or that Satan himself fought him on the way into heaven. While there's no backing for this in scripture, it became an oral tradition that was passed down that God had to slay demons, in other words, in order to rise to the right hand of the throne. And then finally, animals' souls judging humans. So, remember how earlier I
What?
talked that around the throne of God there was the seraphim, or the several winged angels? Well, also mentioned to be
Okay, now why is that three dogs and only one cat? There are three dogs.
around God were oxen and birds and beasts and several different animals. So the idea behind it is, since God is sitting on the throne, and from the throne he judges if someone is saved or not. Again, this is all according to the canon of Christianity. Then maybe these things around the throne are part of it. And on top of that, maybe animals, being a true neutral or a middle ground when it comes to judgment, exist as the mediators to judge humanity. Or in other words, animals
What?
are neither good nor evil, they are simply instinctual and natural, so they work as the perfect litmus test of sorts for people being judged. So according to this belief, be nice.
Yeah, if you watch Casual Geographic and Tier Zoo, you'll realize, mostly Casual Geographic, you'll realize that I won't call animals neutral or good in any sense of the way, most of them. When you go to your animalistic primal self, you're going to be horrendous. But in the end, are you telling me the only cat and dog person is the one who's going to be saved because they're going to be biased? Like, oh, look at that, I know him. That's like, yeah, he was good to dogs.
To animals, you'll literally go to hell for it. And that is it of the Bible theory iceberg. Thank you all so much for watching. If you still are, I know this is like a real
Yeah, there you go. Man, I love that. I love the whole thing, right? The Bible theory iceberg. This was so good. Since the start to the end. I like, Wendigon's theories. One thing I can notice about it is like Christianity, try to incorporate other things with the lesser God and elements like that. I like how people try to make their own thing as like, oh, I'm the prophet myself, but something that just doesn't make sense. So people are like, oh no, that's not part of the Bible. There are many offshoot, basically spin-offs, let's just say, but it's like not canon. But some of them just like make sense to people, so they just accept it as canon. That's what religion is. It's your belief, and if something makes sense to you, you're gonna think it as canon, even though it's probably not, right? So that is interesting. I like how like mostly it's like one element theory. I don't know how to explain this, but it's like a lot of religions basically multiply things. Like there are many gods for this is that. In Christianity, basically, there's just one God. Even Jesus is the same God. It's just one thing, right? And that thing is so powerful. It's like you can't even say its name. You can't even say God's name. Gods like seraphims or whatever, like angels, are so terrifying and so powerful that humans would see them as terrifying. Psychological element behind it, like how humans psychology work. It's interesting how Christianity played that part, right? Like how to make something so gigantic and powerful, and how to describe it basically, which is like really fun. And knowing how most of the Western culture is Christian, and how most of the Western media, Hollywood, is Christian, I'm surprised they didn't use that into some kind of special effect type of thing. I still want to see some like seraphim type, terrifying angel type of like special effect in one of the movies or so, because that would be so awesome. Obviously, Wendigoon's video, like somebody tell me, is there to describe this. I'm gonna watch that tomorrow because that's gonna be awesome. So yeah, all right. If you like my reaction, don't forget to subscribe, and yeah, I'll see you next time.